The actor who was instrumental in getting this 1978 comedy classic made lost out on $14 million because of its success. That story and more as we go into an in-depth look at this timeless comedy classic. That's next. Hi everyone, welcome to Retroflix. This is your channel for retrospectives on movies and television. Today we have a comedy classic that at the time, teenagers that were going into college probably couldn't wait to go to college and be in a fraternity or a sorority or just go and party. Parents after this movie probably scared to death of that thought after watching this movie. Today's feature is a 1978 comedy classic, National Lampoon's Animal House. What a timeless movie. Animal House was the first film produced by National Lampoon. National Lampoon was the most popular humor magazine on college campuses in the mid-70s. It specialized in satire of politics and pop culture. And many of the writers were recent college graduates that knew that college environment. The late filmmaker Ivan Reitman, who at this time had only did one movie. He directed one movie, and that was called Cannibal Girls in Canada for about $5,000. He obviously then would go on to be one of the most famous directors and movie makers of all time, doing, for instance, Stripes and Ghostbusters, and of course many others. He had put together a show in New York City, and this show is called the National Lampoon Show. And this show featured John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Brian Doyle Murray, Bill Murray, and Harold Ramis. And after that was done, that was at the time in 1975 when Saturday Night Live was starting. Saturday Night Live basically hired all of those after that show, hired all of them for Saturday Night Live, and Saturday Night Live began in 75. The only person that was not hired was Harold Ramis. And Ivan Reitman went to Ramis and said, well, do you want to do a movie? He goes, I think this National Lampoon show that we just did with these guys, these comedy skits, I think we should make a movie and do something for National Lampoon. So they ended up calling up Matty Simmons, who was the publisher of the National Lampoon at the time. And I saw an interview with Ivan Reitman, and he said that Matty Simmons at first was a little bit, maybe I got some other things going on, but we'll talk about later. Was kind of really non-committal about that. But eventually ended up saying, yes, let's do this, and they got together. And they got together, Doug Kenny came from the National Lampoon side. Doug Kenny was he started National Lampoon, one of the starters of it, one of the founders of the National Lampoon, which the National Lampoon is really a spin-off of the Harvard Lampoon from Harvard University. But they got Doug Kenny and Harold Ramis together to write. And when they started writing, they were like, we need a little bit more to this. And so from the National Lampoon side, Doug Kenny got a guy named Chris Miller. Now, Chris Miller really probably had even more college experience than maybe Doug Kenny had as far as his experiences in college. Chris Miller went to Dartmouth. And they brought Chris Miller in, and Chris Miller was in a fraternity there. And Chris Miller basically brought in all of his experiences he had as a fraternity brother in Dartmouth. And so they sort of incorporate that into the script that they were writing for what would become Animal House. So Reitman, Simmons, Kenny, and Ramis went to pitch this script to studios, and most studios did not want to deal with this. They just saw, drinking and getting drunk and vomiting and, and all this sort of thing, and that was not something that they wanted to deal with. Well, they finally found a backer in Universal, but Universal basically said, and this came from Harold Ramis, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, well, they basically just threw a little bit of money at us, and he goes, I think that they thought, well, we'll make a few bucks on it. We're not paying much for this movie, and so let them do what they're going to do. And that's what ended up happening. So Universal decided to make this movie. They gave them $3 million, million, which even back at that time, 77, 78, was not a lot of money to make a movie. So that was greenlit. Now they had to find a director. Ivan Reitman wanted to direct this movie, but the studio wouldn't allow it because Reitman at that point again only did Cannibal Girls in Canada for $5,000, and they said, well, that's your only directing experience. We need somebody with a little bit more experience. They didn't want somebody that they're going to have to pay a lot of money to, but they still wanted a director that had a little bit more experience than Reitman did. And so they decided to go with John Landis. And John Landis had just come off a comedy called The Kentucky Fried Movie, which a lot of those the movie makers at the studio actually really liked. And so they went to him and said, would you be interested in doing this movie? And Landis came in and met with them. He said he liked the script. The one thing, though, they needed to do was they needed to have a good fraternity and a bad fraternity. So basically, Animal House is, the Delta House is the bad fraternity, and Omega House is the good fraternity. And the Omega House also has the dean of the college on their side. And Omega House and the dean want to get rid of Delta House. They think these people are just a menace to society, and we need to get rid of this fraternity. And so that's, that's a basic concept of Animal House. And so that was very important for Landis to have that. You couldn't just have bad, you had to have the good. You had to have that conflict as well. And so one of the other stipulations the studio gave to Landis was, we want a known actor in this, a known film actor. So this is going to take us to the cast, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit as far as who this known actor is he's going to get. Now, I'm going to look at the cast here a little bit. I'm going to break this into Delta and Omega House. I'm not going to say every actor, and there's a lot of in here. I'm not going to say them all, but just a few of the major players in it. For Delta House, again, the bad fraternity, is John Belushi. He would play Bluto. Now, John Belushi had a name from Saturday Night Live that was real popular at this point, but he did film before. And then you had Tim Matheson, who he was experienced, but still pretty young, and also James Widows. And so Matheson played Otter, and Widows played Hoover. And so Matheson would go on to have a really phenomenal career through the 80s and 90s and so forth. In fact, I think he even still acts. And James Widows became a pretty successful director. In Omega House, you have Mark Metcalf, who played Niedermeyer, and you might know him if you remember the Twisted Sister video, We're Not Going to Take It. He played the dad in that movie, or in that music video. And he was also the maestro on the Seinfeld, if you remember that episode. I don't know I can't remember. I know there was obviously one, but I don't know if there was more than one episode with the maestro in it. But if you remember that, he was a maestro on Seinfeld. And Kevin Bacon. This was Kevin Bacon's first movie. And he played one of the Omega brothers in this. And he is well known for saying all is well at the end. So if you ever watched this. And some of the others was John Vernon, who played Dean Wormer. Dwayne Jesse played Otis Day of the Otis Day and the Nights, the band that would play at the parties. And Dwayne Jesse then ended up adopting that Otis Day, and he actually continued to play as Otis Day and the Nights. And I don't know, they might still, I'm not quite sure, but they did for years after that. And then Donald Sutherland. Donald Sutherland only had a really small role as a professor. And this is the name actor that we're talking about. And this is the actor who lost the money. So let's talk about that right now. John Landis knew Donald Sutherland from going back in the late 60s. John Landis was a production assistant on a movie called Kelly's Heroes and worked with Donald Sutherland, who was the actor in that movie, and got to know Donald Sutherland. As a matter of fact, John Landis babysat Kiefer. So those of you out there know the actor Kiefer Sutherland. Donald is his dad. So he really knew him, and as a matter of fact, he got Donald Sutherland in the Kentucky Fried Movie. So at that time, John Landis was really kind of just in Hollywood himself. He didn't, know a lot of people. Donald Sutherland was the biggest name he knew. So he went to Donald Sutherland and said, listen, I need somebody for this movie to get this movie made. And Donald Sutherland said, that's fine, I'll do it. Landis said, you're only going to do 2 days, because it's actually a really short, you're not much in there. It's just a really a really short period that Donald Sutherland is in that. So it's not, you're not going to, I just need somebody in there even for a short period of time. And so Sutherland, they were talking about how much he was going to get paid, and Sutherland said, well, I get paid $25,000 a day. And they said, okay, well, we can do that, or we'll give you 2% of the gross sales of the movie. And Donald Sutherland thought to himself, this isn't going to do very well. I don't know if that 2% is a good deal for me. I better just take the guaranteed 25 grand a day for 2 days. So that gives him 50 grand. And so he took that. In Donald Sutherland's estimation, and I read this, an interview with him, and in his estimation, had he taken the 2%, he would have made $14 million. We'll talk later about how much this movie grossed, but it just shows you how well it did. So, $14 million that he had that he lost out on, taking the guaranteed money. And hindsight's 20/20. I mean, Donald Sutherland ended up doing pretty well for himself, but I'm sure that he probably still says, yeah, I wish I would have took the 2%, took the $14 million. He was just like, he said, I just didn't think that movie would do very well, and I better take the guaranteed money, because if it doesn't do very well and I take the 2%, I could not make very much on this, so I'll take the guarantee. Yep. So that's the $14 million story. And so, but that got Universal to be happy with this movie. Now they had to find a location, and they had to find a college campus. And again, just like it was hard to get somebody to do this in the studio to get them to take on this movie, college campuses didn't want this either, because they were afraid that this movie, after reading the script and so forth, that this movie is going to, oh geez, we can't have this here, look what all the students will do after watching this. So they were like, no thank you. But one would, and that was University of Oregon. President William Beatty Boyd was at University of Oregon at the time. Now, years previously, he was at Cal Berkeley, and they wanted to shoot the movie The Graduate there with Dustin Hoffman. However, the powers to be there, including himself, decided not to do that. It became a really successful movie. And so Beatty Boyd said, I'm not going to allow that to happen again if I get another chance. And so he got the other people that were around him to agree with him that, yes, we should allow this movie to happen here. And so they did. So the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon is where this movie is shot. The film was shot in about 32 days. It didn't take very long at all. They wanted to go in and do this quickly and to get it out. So 32 days of shooting. And yes, the food fight scene, if you've ever seen this, is it was a real scene. They're really doing the food fight, and it was actually shot in one take, except for the John Belushi part where he comes in and says food fight. But then the rest of it was shot in one take, and they were told to actually have a food fight on that. The soundtrack of Animal House was an awesome soundtrack. It was a mix of rock and roll and rhythm and blues, and it really brought back some older songs that were played in this movie that got back into American pop culture at that time. And so some of them were Twistin the Night Away by Sam Cooke, Tossin and Turnin, and Bobby Lewis, Shout by the Isley Brothers, which was performed by Otis Day and the Knights in the movie, and of course Louie Louie, who was written by Richard Berry, probably most known for the version by the Kingsmen in 1963, and in the movie Bluto performs it. So, but those songs really then shot up again because the soundtrack of this movie. So phenomenal soundtrack if you like that time period of music. It was screen tested. The movie was screen tested in Denver, and they were. I saw an interview with Ivan Reitman, and they were not really expecting much. They flew into Denver, and they thought this is probably going to be a long flight home. And so they went in and they started screen testing it, and nothing was happening until the scene where Flounder and Pinto come up and say, "Is this the Delta House?" And they asked John Belushi, and he was obviously drinking and urinating, and he turns around and urinates on them and says, "Yeah, right there," you know. And Ivan Reitman said the place just went wild after that. And then after that, it was just, he said the theater was just nuts, and he was like, "Wow, we actually got a hit here." And they did. This was the highest grossing movie until, ironically enough, Ghostbusters, which was directed by Ivan Reitman, right? So in 1984. Up to that point, that was the highest grossing movie. And also, too, Ghostbusters was written by Harold Ramis and starred Harold Ramis. So there's another one, too, with that. So that's kind of interesting. It would go on to gross $141 million on that $3 million budget. The legacy of this movie is just phenomenal. This started that comedy, the comedy trend, you know, coming into the 80s, even the 90s, and maybe even the early 2000s. But certainly in the 80s, when you look at Porky's, and then of course you go to the American Pie films, and of course Old School, and you can even throw like in Police Academy, those type of like raunchier movies. Some of them are, that's this kind of started that became very popular. And you look at John Belushi, for example, this catapulted him, and now he started to do a lot of movies and really made a name for himself there. Just went in the stratosphere. Unfortunately, he died in 1982. But after this, he was a name, no doubt about that. So it really skyrocketed his career. And of course, we talked about Reitman, who then went on to be a very famous director and direct some of the highest grossing movies ever. Harold Ramis became a writer, director, and of course an actor. You look at Stripes, for example. Stripes was directed by Reitman, and Ramis was in that and written by him. And of course, Bill Murray was in that as well, too. That was a top 5 hit, I believe, in 81, I think. Don't quote me on that. I think that was 81. And in 2001, it was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. So again, we've had this before. It was one of those that went in there, which is obviously a huge honor. And Bravo actually had it when it did a list of 100 funniest movies. Animal House was number one. If you haven't seen this movie, there are many places you can go to stream this. Netflix, Peacock, Prime, Vudu, Redbox, and Apple TV are the places right now that you can go and see this movie. So please do that. If you have already seen it before, and hopefully you watch it again, but if not, please comment below, tell me what you think of it. If you haven't seen this, go stream it in one of those places and come back and comment and tell us what you think of it. What are some of your favorite scenes? What the funniest scenes that you like? I look at Bluto with his college shirt, and I had a memory of that where I had a friend of mine that went to the college that I was at the time, and he wasn't in college. We went down to visit us, and he was so excited to come to a college down there that he got a shirt made that just said college on it and came down to us. So that's my memory, of something that came from Animal House. I saw Animal House probably in the 80s at some point. I was probably too young in the 78 to see it then, but in the 80s at some point I did. And I can't say that it didn't have certainly an impact on me wanting to go to college. It certainly did. So anyway, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. I really enjoy doing this with you guys. So please do that, and then you'll be able to see when my new content comes in, and we can have a dialogue. That I really love that. So until next time, that's a wrap.